Throughout history, there are many, many myths and misconceptions about both important and not so important things, and the 1920s is no exception. I'll admit, I've even fallen for some myself. But with this video, I want to correct some of those once and for all. First and foremost, let's start with one myth that I unfortunately included in my first video about 1920s radio. The first commercial radio broadcast. I made a correction in the pinned comment of that video, but I'll go over it here for those who haven't seen it. This myth might be a little bit obscure for people with only a casual interest in the 1920s, so it's a good one to start with. It's commonly tossed around that the KDKA radio station in Pittsburgh made the first commercial radio broadcast when they announced the election results of the 1920 presidential election. But while that November 2nd broadcast did happen, it was not actually the first. There were at least two other stations that beat it to the punch. One was the 8MK station in Detroit, Michigan, which began broadcasting in August of 1920. Another was the 1XE station in Medford Hillside, Massachusetts. That station went back even further, having started making broadcasts of musical performances as early as 1916. So, if these other stations were so well documented, why did the KDKA myth come to be? The 8MK and 1XE stations were both very small and localized, but KDKA was owned by none other than the massive and influential Westinghouse Corporation. Westinghouse was far more ambitious with its plans for its radio station, and put a lot more money into it. It wanted to become mainstream. It wanted to advertise itself as an innovative and historic part of radio history. And what better way to do that than to claim to be the station that made the first commercial radio broadcast? Perhaps the small number of 8MK and 1XE listeners would know the claim wasn't true, but radio was just beginning to enter the public consciousness, and not many people had their own radio sets yet. It also depends on your definition of commercial. Let's take a look at one given definition that defines commercials specifically for radio and television as funded by the revenue from broadcast advertisements. In these very early days of radio, commercial broadcast didn't mean running advertisements during a program and getting money by those means. For a long time, the vast majority of people who knew about early radio were convinced that KDKA did in fact make the first commercial radio broadcast, because they would see no reason not to believe it. And thus, KDKA got away with it, and for many, many years. But Westinghouse's reign of misinformation and myth-making is over. With that said though, KDKA was still doing a lot of cool things in radio at that time, and they should definitely receive credit for helping the medium of radio develop in the 1920s. Since many of my subscribers are people already interested in 1920s things, this one might not come as much of a surprise since it's kind of well known, but I still feel compelled to include it. The 1927 Warner Brothers film The Jazz Singer was not actually the first sound film, and its status as the first talkie is sometimes misunderstood. And actually, there is a difference between sound film and talkie, but I'll get into that a bit later. The origins of synchronized sound films date back to the mid-1890s, when Edison made what is now called the Dixon Experimental Sound Film, featuring William Dixon, a fellow inventor, playing a violin into a big amplifying horn. Fast forward to 1923, 4 years before the release of The Jazz Singer, and the inventor Lee DeForest has developed the phonofilm process with another man named Theodore Case, which recorded sound directly onto the same strip of film that the picture was on, instead of being recorded separately but simultaneously. He produced a number of short films featuring synchronized sound. These were usually just performances by musicians or vaudevillians.
Lovely chap, but he's gone, poor fella. With good behavior, he ought to be out in 1927 or 8.
DeForest even had public exhibitions and toured around the US, showing everyone his new novelty. If you want to hear a contemporary article written about Lee DeForest and how phonofilm worked, you can watch a video I made about it from Photoplay magazine. Warner Brothers was the first Hollywood studio to really pursue sound films, mostly through the zeal of Sam Warner. They used a sound process called Vitaphone, which had been developed by Bell Laboratories at Western Electric. This process is what was used for The Jazz Singer. And The Jazz Singer must have been the first film that used Vitaphone, right? Well, no. And this is where we have to get a little nitpicky with definitions. Was The Jazz Singer the first film with synchronized sound? That's a definite no, even in terms of Hollywood movies. The 1926 film Don Juan was the first feature film with synchronized sound, and it too used the Vitaphone process. Though it did not contain any spoken dialogue, but rather a recorded musical score and sound effects. And this was called a sound film. But was The Jazz Singer the first talkie? Well, sort of. In a way, maybe. But that also depends on your definition. So, what's the difference? In the films that used Vitaphone before The Jazz Singer, only sound effects and music were heard, not dialogue. There is spoken dialogue in The Jazz Singer, but it only makes up a very, very small portion of the movie.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet.
This spoken dialogue was, let's say, lightly sprinkled around musical numbers. About 1/4 of the film has sound, and an even smaller part of that actually has spoken dialogue. Other than the musical numbers, the rest of the film was still done in the silent film format, using intertitles to show dialogue between characters. So how does that spoken dialogue compare with, let's say, this phonofilm from 1924 of President Calvin Coolidge making a speech?
Assessed upon the people. This means that the farmer is doomed to provide a certain amount of money.
Well, because Coolidge isn't a character, but rather an actual person who's not acting, so it's not dialogue. But more importantly, it wasn't a movie in the standard sense, since there's no story, it's just documentation. A quick search for the definition of a talkie says, a film with a soundtrack, as distinct from a silent film. But with this definition, there seems to be no differentiation from sound films. If you want to define a talkie as an all-talking film with synchronized spoken dialogue, then the first true talkie was The Lights of New York from 1928, which also used the Vitaphone process. Of course, there was also the short period of part talkies, where there would either be a silent film or a sound film with some sequences of synchronized spoken dialogue. But is a part talkie the same as a talkie? I'll leave that up to you. As a little note, The Jazz Singer might not have even been the first feature film that contained synchronized spoken dialogue. Another Warner Brothers film that used the Vitaphone process might be able to claim that title. The Better Ol' was released in 1926, the year before The Jazz Singer. In that film, one character whispers something, which some believe is the word coffee, though this is disputed. So, in short, The Jazz Singer was not the first film to utilize synchronized sound, but it might have been the first feature film to contain synchronized sound with spoken dialogue. That's a mouthful, I know. It's very much just a problem of specific categorization. Did those short moments of spoken dialogue qualify the movie as a talkie? To me, that sounds pretty subjective. I'm not sure there's a precise, agreed-upon definition of what a talkie really is, but anyway, that's that. I think this misconception is at least partly due to how black and white this is usually taught. The 1920s often gets boiled down to flappers, jazz, and prohibition, and to a lesser extent, talkies. The transition period between silent films and talkies is often glossed over or cut out entirely, and we're left with only silent films and only talkies, excluding the short partial talkies and sound effects on disc era, which lasted less than 2 years roughly. So with this approach of learning about talkies, it's no wonder that the classification became so black and white. What is true is that The Jazz Singer did kick off the talkie revolution, and proved that they could be successful, at least as a novelty for the time being. And by the way, stay tuned for a more detailed look at the transition to sound film in the 1920s. I plan on making that video in the near future. This next one might come as a disappointment to some, and others probably already know. F. Scott Fitzgerald's popular and very famous novel, The Great Gatsby, must have been a rousing success in the 1920s, with all of its partying and hedonistic behavior that we all know and love today, right? Not exactly. Contemporary book sales were very unimpressive, to say the least. Between The Great Gatsby's publication in 1925 to Fitzgerald's death in 1940, a mere 25,000 copies were sold. And of course, in the 1920s alone, that figure would have been even less. The reviews of the book were pretty positive, but the public just didn't take to it for some reason or another. At least, not compared with today. In the trailer for the now lost film, it was called a record-selling novel, which is either not true or very misleading. For a literary book, the sales figures weren't that bad, especially considering that the competition for a truly mainstream audience was pretty fierce, what with easily accessible pulp fiction and popular novels. We can compare the sales numbers of The Great Gatsby with other contemporary novels. One of the most popular books of the 1920s was Main Street by Sinclair Lewis, which sold 180,000 copies only 6 months after its publication in 1920, reaching into the millions by the end of the decade. At the other end of the decade, in 1929, we have Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, which had a first-run print of 31,000 copies. And that same year, All Quiet on the Western Front broke 1 million copies sold within a year of publication. You might be thinking, well, those novels were just outliers, and sales of The Great Gatsby weren't bad in Fitzgerald's case. Interestingly, Fitzgerald's first novel, This Side of Paradise, was a pretty big hit when it was first published, selling more than 49,000 copies within the first 2 years. His second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, published in 1922, sold even better. In the 1920s alone, at least 70,000 copies of The Beautiful and Damned were printed. But Fitzgerald's first 2 novels are far lesser known today than his magnum opus, The Great Gatsby, which again sold only 25,000 copies in its first 15 years of publication. Fitzgerald's short stories were also printed in popular magazines such as the Saturday Evening Post, Vanity Fair, and Collier's. Selling his short stories to these magazines is really how the Fitzgeralds made most of their money. And especially when compared to all of this, The Great Gatsby did very little for him at the time. As I mentioned before, there was a Great Gatsby film made in 1926, though it's now a lost film. Because it's lost, we don't have a lot of information on it, but perhaps the book was commandeered by the film industry, and the literary nature of the novel was spliced up, and more room was made for the exciting dancing and jazz and fun. Fitzgerald and his wife, Zelda, reportedly hated the film, and Fitzgerald himself talked cynically of having to appeal to popular taste to make a living as a writer, and unfortunately sacrificing literary integrity in the process. But if Fitzgerald ever thought his legacy as a serious writer was ruined, fate had other plans, and The Great Gatsby became one of the greatest sleeper hits of all time, though it took a while. The Great Gatsby only really entered the mainstream around World War II, because it was one of the books distributed to soldiers overseas. In fact, 5 times more copies were made then than were ever made in Fitzgerald's lifetime. Now, that number has skyrocketed into the millions. Today, The Great Gatsby is an enduring piece of literature, and is commonly proclaimed the greatest novel of the 1920s, and one of the best in all American literature. But its status as a symbol of the 1920s should be treated more carefully. The Great Gatsby should not be taken so much as a representation of what popular reading material in the 1920s was like, and should not be seen as enormously influential on 1920s culture, but it is a reflection of society at that time. F. Scott Fitzgerald was very keen about his social and cultural observations, and while he's known for showing us the fun, carefree side of things, he wrote about so much more than that. He skillfully captured the disillusionment of the lost generation and the severe negative effects of such a hedonistic society. He showed the nuance of a time period that is often upheld as a golden age, and that it was not perfect. And that is the true value of The Great Gatsby. This commentary is especially poignant knowing that Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda, who were both known for their partying natures, both died prematurely in their 40s, Fitzgerald himself a broken man, Zelda spending her last years with mental illness. So the next time you imagine a lavish, Gatsby-esque party, know that the message of the original novel does not condone 1920s-style hedonism as a means for achieving happiness, though the exact details can be argued about for hours. Some of you might just think I'm stating the obvious, But for people my age, when we had to read The Great Gatsby in high school, the teachers just didn't talk that much about the context of the story, at least not in my case. And I've heard other people say the same thing. They focused so much on the symbolism of objects and didn't spend so much time on the overall theme as it related to 1920s society. So if you've read the book as an adult, this was probably a bit obvious, but this section was mostly for those who only know about the aesthetic of the novel from popular culture. In this modern society of ours, the pop culture influence of The Great Gatsby can be a bit superficial, and I would like to see that changed, though it would make it a bit more depressing that way. I don't know, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Okay, I talked about this once before in one of my channel update videos a long time ago, but I thought this would be a good time to mention it again, in detail. Quite a few people actually got very upset because of the way I pronounced Louis Armstrong's name. It's often said that it's pronounced Louis, but Armstrong himself usually said Louis, at least in private. But wait, before you click out of this video in disgust, hear me out. Armstrong was born and raised in New Orleans, a very diverse city with a large French influence, and in French the name Louis would be pronounced Louis. I don't think that's new information for many people. Because Armstrong lived and was associated with New Orleans, many people just assumed that his name was pronounced Louis. He became a symbol of the city. However, Armstrong did not grow up in the more heavily French-influenced district, but rather the poorer section of town that contained the more earthy things like honky-tonks and prostitutes. Armstrong wrote in 1944 that, "Only white people call me Louis," though that was a bit of an exaggeration. As he became more popular, Louis just stuck. The general public knew him as Louis, and it became kind of his brand. He represented New Orleans and the musical movement that came from there, and New Orleans was associated with its French influence, even though it didn't encompass the entire city. And Armstrong was a man of many nicknames. Fellow musicians would almost always call him Pops, Satchmo, or Satch, and people from his really early career might have even called him Dippermouth decades later. I have looked up many authorities on Louis Armstrong, and all of the ones I looked at pronounced it Louis. Terry Teachout wrote a well-respected biography on Armstrong, and he pronounced it like that when he gave talks. The name is pronounced that way in Ken Burns' famous jazz documentary series, and the famous jazz player, Wynton Marsalis, who has only the utmost respect for Armstrong and is one of his biggest jazz idols, also says Louis in interviews. And according to the producer for the recording session of Hello Dolly, Mickey Capp, when he suggested that Armstrong open up the song with, "Hello Dolly, this is Louis Dolly," Armstrong responded with, "It's not Louis, it's Louis." So then is the Louis pronunciation wrong? No, at least I wouldn't say so. Language is about accepted use. If so many people say it one way, it just becomes acceptable, regardless of the original intent or pronunciation. But at the same time, Louis is also not wrong, because that's what the man himself said, which does carry quite a bit of weight. Even though it's not this simple, think of Louis as sort of a stage name. Because he was such an enormously popular entertainer, Louis was the more common one among the public. Although I'm sure many will inevitably disagree with me, I would say that neither is wrong. Like I said before, Armstrong was a man of many names, and didn't really take this kind of stuff too seriously. He would probably just be amused that so many people now still have such strong opinions about it. Louis, Louis, he went by both of those names, and many more. This has been a surprisingly contentious issue in the comments section of my slang video, and in some people's eyes I've been discredited just because of this small issue, and I don't really understand it. I'm sure I'll get plenty of corrections in this video too, but I'm not getting involved anymore with that. I think we can just all agree that he was one cool dude and he made some great music. Another less common misconception about the pronunciation of a name is that of William Edward Burghardt, better known as W.E.B. Du Bois. His last name might look like it's pronounced with a French flair as Dubois, but he has directly stated that he always pronounced it as the very American-sounding Du Bois. While he's a bit less of a mainstream figure than Louis Armstrong, I thought I would just throw this one in as a bonus. If you've been watching my videos for a long time, you probably know that I've mispronounced some words. stucco, 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 stucco. But this time, I actually went in and did the research for these specific examples. And while I'm on the topic of pronunciation, another one has repeatedly popped up in my slang video that I really want to put to rest. Many people commented that the word chic is actually pronounced shake, and this is kind of similar to the Louis Armstrong thing. For many words, there is no proper way to say it between all the various English-speaking countries. In this case, from what I gather, it seems to be mostly a case of British versus American pronunciation. Some people were saying that shake is closer to the original Arabic pronunciation, and I don't know for sure if that's the case. But like many words when they transfer over to other languages, the pronunciation also changes, as well as the nuance or even its overall meaning. In the United States, where the 1920s slang meaning was popularized, it was definitely pronounced chic. If you don't believe me, you can look up some songs that use the word. The ones that first came to my mind were Lovin' Sam, the Chic of Alabama, recorded by various people, and Who, You, That's Who by Annette Hanshaw. Here's a clip of the last one.
Who is my favorite chic? Whose kisses make me weep? Who, you, that's who.
I hadn't been aware that it was pronounced differently in the UK, since it's a fairly uncommon word nowadays. Since I kept getting comments about these pronunciations, I thought I would try to clear things up. I've been hanging on to them for a while. I'm not saying that I've never messed up the pronunciation of someone's name or other words in my videos, but for these I did some actual research, so I like to think I know what I'm talking about this time. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I tried to include common and uncommon myths and misconceptions, so I hope you learned at least one new thing. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.